In this section, we're going to look at two important components to economic, social and cultural rights, and these are the concepts of progressive realisation and justiciability. So first we're looking at progressive realisation. Now this is found in the convention itself. Justiciability is not, it's more of an outside concept. Progressive realisation is primarily used to determine what are the obligations of the state towards realising economic, social and cultural rights. Now we can see that when we look at the article itself, let's just make sure you can read that. So Article 2 of the ICESCR says each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take steps individually and through international assistance and so on and so on. Now what it's detailing here is that this is what the state's obligations are towards realising economic, social and cultural rights. Now how progressive realisation is defined itself in Article 2 is rather long and rather wordy and a bit complex. But also it's important to kind of unpack it to see how each of these elements adds up to this idea of progressive realisation. So let's go through and unpack these various parts to it. So first, each party to the present covenant, a state party means a state that has ratified the treaty and is therefore legally bound by it. First, they've got to undertake to take steps. Now, undertaking and taking steps are distinct, but they are related. So undertake means that you've agreed that you're going to take the measures to realise these rights. But taking steps means you're actually going to do stuff. There is going to be something positive, something physical which is done, whether that's writing a policy, spending some money, doing some programming. But states must, in order to meet people's rights to work, health, education, that first they've got to undertake the process and they've got to actually take steps, they've got to do things. Next, you've got this individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical. Now that means the state must do it on its own individually, but also they do it through international assistance. And that kind of works two ways. It both means that states have the duty to provide international assistance where it's needed, in the form of, primarily in the form of international aid or overseas development assistance, but of course it could also be in foreign direct investment or in other ways. But there is both an obligation on the international community to help, but also an obligation on states to allow international assistance. And this, for some countries, this can be sensitive. We know North Korea is very sensitive about international assistance. In some areas around health or reproductive health, some countries may not agree to the standards of international reproductive health or the access to, say, family planning. So there are some areas where it can be sensitive. And that cooperation can be economic and technical. Economic, of course, meaning primarily money, and technical meaning kind of advice and technology and so on. Okay, so after the international assistance, we then have the state's got to realise these rights to the maximum of its available resources. And this is open to a lot of interpretation and a lot of debate. So it means that states have to use their resources as well as they can to its maximum amount to realise the right to food, water, housing, education, and so on. So firstly, what are the available resources? This is going to mean things like it could be financial resources like money in the bank or the savings. It could be natural resources like making sure that your land is growing food, or your other resources that you can get in the country are being used for food, water, housing, and education, and so on. It's also human capital as well, that people should be devoted, that the human resources should be there to educate people or for health and so on. But it means that the state is using those resources to the maximum to realise these rights. Now, cases where that doesn't occur is, for example, when a state, say, doesn't collect taxes from the wealthy, and because those taxes from the wealthy could pay for education and health. It could be where the best and brightest people go and work overseas, is what may happen in, say, the health industry. So you may train a whole lot of nurses, but they then go away to Europe and they do nursing in Europe rather than your own country. It may be that scientists are building weapons and not looking at, say, hunger or agriculture. For example, that may happen in North Korea. But you see that the state has to make sure its resources are devoted to meeting economic, social and cultural rights. Of course, that's going to be open to a lot of debate, but This is and this is why it's one of the areas where there is a lot of debate about this element of progressive realization. And next, you've got that the right has to be achieved progressively. That means the state should be working step by step towards ensuring that people have health, education, food, and so on. And what this means is it shouldn't be going backwards. Like there shouldn't be more homeless people than there were previously. There shouldn't be, less health or less education available. The education, health, all those rights should be increasing progressively towards what's next, the full realization. Okay. And then you say the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means. This last bit's important, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. It means that economic, social, and cultural rights should be in the law. Now, in some areas, there are quite strong laws around economic, social, and cultural rights. So rights around work and the workplace, there tend to be laws there. The laws may not be perfect, but they do exist. They may be weak in, say, maternity leave or sexual harassment. But workers' rights in most countries are quite clear. Same with housing rights. It tends to be rights around owning a house, owning property, renting a house, and so on. But when we look at, say, rights to food and water, often these are not protected by law. They may be subjects of humanitarian aid, but there's very few countries that have laws which ensure that people's right to food and rights to water are protected. So that's the area where you need the adoption of legislative measures. So just to kind of sum that up, we've got those key issues, these key areas of undertaking and taking steps with international assistance or individually, maximum resources, achieving progressively, the idea of full realization, and the legislative measures. So progressive realization is quite complex, and judging states on whether they are progressively realizing rights is open to a lot of debate. And that's why we see it doesn't tend to be, states don't get criticized too harshly on progressive realization unless there are very clear violations, say spending on military as opposed to spending on education, or say refusing international assistance. Only where there are clear-cut cases are there criticisms of that. Now, regardless of progressive realization, most rights have what's known as a minimum core standard. So these are not progressively realized. These are going to be rights from the moment you ratify the treaty, rights instantly. And for example, for food, there should be no starvation in a country. You don't progressively realize no starvation. You progressively realize everyone's rights to sustainable sources of food. Same with education. Primary education is minimum core that has to be provided immediately, well actually 2 years after in the case of ICESCR. But high school and university are progressively realized that more and more students get access to high school, becomes compulsory, at an older age. So as you know, throughout Southeast Asia or throughout Asia, the age of compulsory primary education does vary. In Thailand, it's 15. I think in the Philippines, it might be 17, I'm not sure. In Myanmar, it's 11. But this is an example of progressive realization, of progressively realizing more compulsory education or more free education in high school. Okay, the minimum core is in terms of work as things like no discrimination. So you progressively realize everyone's right to employment, but no work should be based on discrimination. So it means we have two elements, the minimum core elements, which are like the rights no matter what that you have, like not starving or primary education. Then we have the progressively realized elements, which are these parts which gradually the state are going to realize as they develop more and as they devote more resources to them. Okay, now in terms of understanding progressive realization, this is where the Limburg and Maastricht declarations and instruments come in, because they kind of detail some key elements of understanding this. So this is where a group of experts came together, I think 20 years ago perhaps, to kind of help kind of describe and understand what progressive realization means and how we understand economic and social and cultural rights. So they made some important kind of distinctions here. The first ones are states have obligations of result, but meaning that the obligations there of the states, obligations of result, not obligations of action, meaning the intention be, the right should be how many less people are homeless, how many more children have education, not what homeless programs you run or not what education programs you run, but actual hardcore numbers. Are there more kids going to school? Are there less people being homeless? So you've also got the maximum available resources and the allocation of resources. They are allocated fairly between the different sectors and the different rights. Okay, there are elements, as you mentioned before, about the use of international assistance. It is important that policy and legislation are necessary. You can't just end homelessness without having a policy on it. There must be clear standards there, and it's kind of like, in a sort of a sense, like a rule of law. It must be written down where the state is going to commit to certain standards and certain procedures in terms of realising these rights. The element of non-regression is important, that you can't regress. So there can't be more homeless people or less kids educated. It always must be working towards some kind of goals. So there is a violation when the states regress in terms of those numbers. Also in terms of resources, obviously states with more resources have more obligations. So the richer you are, the less people that should be homeless, or the more kids should have education. And they also made clear that violations of minimum core were human rights violations. So coming back to the example of the woman begging, because she's begging may not be a violation, but there may be some minimum core violations there if she's hungry and can't afford food. And the state, in order to work out if there is a violation, you can go through these Limburg and Maastricht standards in terms of, are there obligations of result? Is there any regression? What's the policy? And so on. Okay, so we're going to pause here.